My granddaughter called me at 1:17 in the morning, and the first thing I heard was not her voice but the sound underneath it. The ragged, careful breathing of someone trying not to be heard crying. "Grandpa," she whispered, "please don't tell Mom I called you. Please. I don't know who else to call." I was already sitting up in bed. 41 years of designing structures that carry the weight of human lives teaches you something that never leaves you. Even after you retire, even after the calluses on your hands have gone soft again, it teaches you to hear the difference between a sound that means nothing and a sound that means everything. This was the second kind. "Lily," I said. "Where are you?" "St. Vincent's," she said. "The emergency room. They brought me here in an ambulance, Grandpa, but I didn't call it. Nathan called it. He told them I hurt myself on purpose, and Mom is standing right outside the curtain, and she hasn't come in to see me once, and I'm scared and my wrist hurts, and I don't understand what's happening." I told her I was coming. I did not tell her to calm down, because in 35 years of standing on scaffolding 200 feet above a river watching a joint under stress, I learned that telling a frightened person to calm down accomplishes nothing except making them feel alone in their fear. Instead, I told her the only thing that mattered: I am 15 minutes away. Do not sign anything. Do not answer any question you do not want to answer. I am coming. My name is Walter Hendricks. I am 64 years old. For 35 years, I was a structural engineer for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and for the last 11 of those years, I ran the state's Bridge Inspection Division out of Pittsburgh, responsible for certifying the safety of every span across the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio. I have stood in the guts of steel structures built in 1931 and told grown men with union pins on their hats that the bridge they had crossed every day of their working lives needed to be closed within the week, because a single load-bearing gusset plate had corroded past the point of trust. I have been right about failure before failure happened. It is, without question, the strangest kind of expertise a man can carry, the ability to look at something everyone else believes is solid and see, instead, the exact place where it is quietly coming apart. Nothing in those 35 years prepared me for the moment my 15-year-old granddaughter called me from a hospital bed, because the man her mother married had put her there. Before I tell you what happened that night, and in the 11 days that followed, I want you to sit with something for a moment, because I think many of you already carry it. There is a particular kind of dread that lives specifically in the chest of a grandparent, not the sharp panic of a parent, which burns hot and fast, but something slower and colder, something that has had years to accumulate. It is the dread of having watched, from a careful and respectful distance, while your child made a choice you were afraid of, and having said nothing, because you told yourself it was not your place. If you are a grandparent, and you have ever felt that particular silence sitting in your chest like a stone you were too polite to name out loud, then you already understand exactly where this story begins. My daughter Margaret, Maggie, we have always called her, since she was small enough to fit in the crook of my arm on a job site, lost her husband David 5 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, the fast and merciless kind. 11 weeks from the day of diagnosis to the day I stood beside her at the cemetery on a hill above the Monongahela and watched her hold Lily's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. David built custom docks and boathouses along the lake communities 2 hours north of the city, and he was, without exaggeration, one of the gentlest men I have ever known. He coached Lily's swim team. He built her a scale model of the Roberto Clemente Bridge out of basswood and brass pins for her 10th birthday, because she had told him, very seriously, that she wanted to understand what her grandfather did for a living, and he had come to me and asked me to walk him through the truss geometry so he could get it right for her. I still have that model on a shelf in my study. I look at it more often than I probably should. When David died, something in Maggie went quiet in a way that never fully came back. She grieved the way some people grieve, alone, at odd hours, behind a closed door, presenting a composed face to the world during daylight, and falling apart somewhere I could not see after dark. I watched this happen from what I believed was a respectful distance, because Maggie is a grown woman with a spine of her own, and I have always believed, perhaps too strongly, that a father's job is to be present without being intrusive, to let his children find their footing even when watching them stumble, puts a physical ache behind his sternum. Nathan Cross entered her life 19 months after David's funeral. He was a financial advisor with an office downtown in one of the glass towers along the river, the kind of man who wore his cufflinks a half size too large so you would notice them, and who shook my hand for exactly 1 second longer than a handshake requires. I felt something shift wrong in my gut the first time I met him. At a dinner Maggie arranged so carefully it was clear she had rehearsed the evening in her head a dozen times beforehand, terrified of what I might think. I told myself that night, and for months afterward, that I was simply an old man unwilling to accept that anyone could replace what David had been. I told myself I owed my daughter my silence and my patience. I have spent 35 years teaching younger engineers that the first sign of a structural problem is rarely the collapse. It is the hairline crack that everyone around it has learned to walk past without seeing. I saw the crack in Nathan Cross the first night I met him, and I walked past it because I did not trust my own eyes over my daughter's happiness. They married 14 months later. Lily was 13. She was quiet in the particular way that children become quiet when they are carrying something they don't yet have language for. She played violin seriously, 3 hours some evenings, and she filled sketchbook after sketchbook with drawings of bridges and buildings, half studies of real structures she'd seen, and half things that existed only in her imagination. Cantilevers that shouldn't have been able to stand, but somehow on paper did. She was not a difficult child. She was not a troubled child. She was a grieving child who missed her father and was trying, in the quiet architecture of her own drawings, to build something steady in a house that had suddenly filled up with a stranger's furniture and a stranger's rules, and a stranger's voice down the hall at night. The drive to St. Vincent's took me 13 minutes at that hour, with the city empty and the traffic lights blinking yellow the whole way down. I ran 2 of them. I am not going to pretend I felt any guilt about it. When I walked into the emergency department, the charge nurse behind the intake desk looked up, and something in her face shifted into recognition before I had said a word. "Mr. Hendricks," she said. I did not know her personally, but 11 years running bridge safety for this city means your face ends up on the local news more often than you'd like, especially the year the Fern Hollow span came down on the news feeds, and I was the man standing in front of the cameras explaining, in plain language, exactly which failure mode had done it, and exactly why the warning signs had been visible for years to anyone who knew how to look. People in this city remember that face. I told her I was there for my granddaughter, Lily Reyes, and I needed to see her immediately. She came around the desk without asking me anything further and led me back through the doors herself. I found Lily in a curtained bay near the end of the corridor, sitting upright on the exam table in a hospital gown someone had draped over her own pajama shirt, a thin white plastic bracelet circling her left wrist, and above that wrist, just below the sleeve, a bruise blooming dark purple against skin that had been perfectly fine 10 days earlier when she'd sat at my kitchen table, eating a second helping of my chili and laughing so hard at one of my old inspection stories that she'd nearly knocked over her glass of milk. When she saw me come through the curtain, her face did the thing that teenagers' faces do when they are trying with everything they have not to cry in front of the person whose opinion of their strength matters most to them. She failed. I crossed the small space in 2 steps and put my arms around her, and she gripped the back of my jacket with both hands and shook. "I'm not lying, Grandpa," she said into my shoulder. "I didn't hurt myself. I promise you I didn't do this." "I know," I told her. "I already know. Breathe. Tell me what happened from the beginning slowly." She pulled back and wiped her face with the heel of her hand and glanced past me at the curtain, checking the way a person checks who has already learned that being overheard has consequences. "Mom and Nathan are in the family waiting room," she said. "They told the doctor I've been hurting myself for months, that I have severe depression and I've been refusing treatment. Nathan brought a folder, Grandpa. An actual folder, with papers already printed out, like he'd had it ready. He handed it to the doctor before anyone even asked him for it. I asked her what had actually happened that night in her own words, slowly, the way I used to ask a bridge inspector to walk me through exactly what he'd seen before he called in a structural concern, because the exact sequence always matters more than the summary. I heard them arguing, she said, around midnight. Not the words, just the sound of it. Nathan gets loud in this specific way, and then Mom was crying. And then it went quiet, and the quiet scared me more than the yelling did. So I got up to check on her. When I opened my door, Nathan was already standing in the hallway with his phone against his ear. And he looked right at me and said, into the phone, "Yes, we need an ambulance. I think my stepdaughter is having a mental health crisis." And I said, "What are you talking about? I'm fine." And I tried to go back into my room, and he grabbed my arm to stop me, and I pulled away, and that's how this happened. She touched the bruise lightly with 2 fingers. Mom came out of their room right when it happened, and she just stood in the hallway and watched. She didn't say anything. She still hasn't said anything to me since we got here. I thanked her, told her to sit tight, and made her repeat back to me, word for word, that she would not sign a single document and would not speak to anyone else until I returned. She nodded, then she caught my sleeve before I could step out. "Grandpa," she said, quieter now, "there's something else. Something I've been trying to tell Mom for weeks, but every time I bring it up, Nathan finds out somehow, and then things get worse at home for a few days. He keeps asking her about Dad's life insurance, about the account with my name on it, about who controls it, and when I turn 18 and what happens to it if—" She stopped. "If something happened to me or to Mom." I've heard him ask that more than once. I let the curtain fall closed behind me and stood in the corridor for a moment, doing what I have always done when a piece of information arrives that changes the shape of everything around it. I built a mental drawing of it, the way I would sketch a load path on a napkin, before the formal calculations ever began. A stepfather, a midnight call to an ambulance, a folder of documents prepared in advance, and a trust fund that a 15-year-old girl was not supposed to know her stepfather was asking questions about. I walked to the nurse's station and asked to speak with the attending physician. She was a woman in her 30s with the particular tired steadiness of someone who has learned to navigate family chaos without picking a side too early. She told me Lily had been brought in by a family member reporting a self-harm incident, that a full psychiatric evaluation had not yet been completed, and that the intake paperwork submitted by the stepfather included a printed behavioral log spanning several months and a referral letter from a psychiatrist named Dr. Owen Hale, recommending immediate admission to a 14-day residential program at a facility called Silver Oak Adolescent Center. I asked to read the letter. She hesitated, the way professionals hesitate when a stranger asks for something they are not required to give. I told her, evenly, that I was Lily's maternal grandfather, that her father was deceased, and that I intended to serve as her advocate for as long as this evening required it. I also told her, because 35 years of certifying structures for public safety teaches you that credentials open doors that pleading never will, that a document produced by a family member at 1 a.m, describing months of behavioral decline, that no teacher, no violin instructor, and no family member present at dinner 10 days earlier had noticed, was the kind of document that deserved to be read very, very carefully before it was allowed to shape a medical decision about a child. She studied me for a long moment. Then she handed me the letter, Dr. Owen Hale, board certified, a practice address in a medical plaza on the east side of the city. The letter was written in the particular clinical language that sounds precise and is, on closer reading, almost entirely unsupported by anything specific, references to escalating isolative behavior, an unspecified incident involving property damage in October, and persistent refusal to engage with family support structures. It recommended 14 days of inpatient evaluation at Silver Oak, effective immediately. I folded the letter and put it in my coat pocket, and I walked to the family waiting room. Nathan was sitting in the far corner with his legs crossed and his phone resting face down on his knee, wearing the particular loose-shouldered posture of a man who believes the outcome of the evening has already been decided in his favor. Maggie sat beside him, smaller than I remembered her being, Her hands folded so tightly in her lap the knuckles had gone pale, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere on the floor tile. She did not look up when I walked in. My daughter has looked up when I entered a room since she was old enough to recognize the sound of my footsteps. The fact that she didn't told me more than anything Nathan could have said. "Walter," Nathan said, standing, extending his hand for that same 1 second too long handshake. "I'm glad you're here. This has been an incredibly difficult night, and Maggie needs her father right now." I did not take his hand. I looked at my daughter instead. "Maggie. How did Lily's arm get bruised?" She flinched visibly, like the question itself had weight. Nathan answered before she found her voice. "She was agitated," he said. "She came out of her room in a state. There was a physical struggle in the hallway. It happens, with kids going through a crisis like this. The important thing now is getting her stabilized before it escalates into something worse. I have spent 3.5 decades learning to let self-silence do work that words cannot." I said nothing. I simply looked at him. Nathan Cross, like most men who are used to controlling a room through the sound of their own voice, was deeply uncomfortable with silence, and he filled it, explaining the folder he'd prepared, invoking Dr. Hale's credentials, describing Silver Oak's program in a level of specific detail that told me, more clearly than any accusation could have, that he had researched this facility long before tonight. When he finally stopped, I asked him one question. "How long have you known Dr. Hale?" "We were referred to him by a colleague of mine," he began. "That isn't what I asked you," I said. "How long have you personally known him?" He shifted his weight just slightly, the way a beam shifts under a load it wasn't rated for. "A few months," he said. "He comes highly recommended." I nodded once, said nothing further, and walked back out into the corridor. I sat with Lily for a while, brought her water, found a low-volume news channel on the wall-mounted television, and let her rest while I read Dr. Hale's letter 3 more times and made notes on my phone. Then I stepped outside into the cold pre-dawn air, and I called a man named Frank Delgado. Frank had spent 26 years as a detective with the Pittsburgh police, the last 9 of them in financial crimes, before retiring 3 years back to open a small private investigation practice out of a converted storefront in Lawrenceville. We had known each other since a bridge inspection case 15 years earlier had turned into a fraud investigation none of us expected, and in the years since we had developed the kind of friendship that survives a 4 a.m. phone call without complaint. I told him everything: the ambulance call, the pre-printed folder, the referral letter, the questions about David's life insurance. Frank was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then he said, "Give me 2 hours." And he hung up, because Frank has never in his life wasted a word on a sentence that didn't need saying. I went back inside. Lily had fallen into a thin, restless sleep with the television murmuring low beside her, and I sat in the plastic chair next to the bed and read Dr. Owen Hale's letter for a 4th time, and somewhere behind my ribs, in the place where 35 years of engineering had trained me to feel the difference between a structure under ordinary stress and a structure that is quietly, systematically being pushed toward failure, I understood that I was no longer looking at a family crisis. I was looking at a plan. Frank called back in 90 minutes, not 2 hours, which told me he had found something worth interrupting his own timeline for. "Owen Hale," he said, without preamble, "surrendered his DEA controlled substances registration 4 years ago, quietly. No public disciplinary filing, which usually means a settlement that both sides had an interest in keeping buried. He's still licensed to practice, still board certified, but he doesn't carry a hospital admitting privilege anywhere in the county anymore. What he does have is a consulting arrangement with 3 residential adolescent facilities in the greater Pittsburgh area. One of them is Silver Oak Consulting Arrangement," I said. "Referral fees, structured as consulting fees, so they don't have to call them what they are. It's public record if you know where to look. Silver Oak is technically a non-profit, which means their filings are open. Hale pulled in $51,000 from that consulting relationship last fiscal year alone." I asked him what he could find on Silver Oak's ownership structure. He told me to give him until morning, and then because Frank has never once in the years I've known him let a piece of a puzzle sit unexamined when he could keep pulling at it. He asked me a question of his own. Walter, you said the stepfather's been asking about a trust fund. You know what's in it? Not the exact terms, I admitted. Find out before you do anything else, he said. Everything about tonight makes a lot more sense once you know exactly what's sitting at the bottom of it. I called Diane Whitfield next. Diane had handled my estate planning and, more relevantly, David's estate after he died, guiding Maggie through probate during a period when Maggie could barely bring herself to open her own mail. Diane has the particular temperament of a woman who genuinely does her best thinking at 5 in the morning with a legal pad and a cup of coffee gone cold beside her, and she picked up on the second ring without a trace of sleep in her voice. I laid it out for her, the referral letter, the 14-day recommendation, Silver Oak, Nathan's questions about the trust, the bruise on Lily's arm. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I need 2 hours. Do not, under any circumstances, let that girl sign a single piece of paper. Not an admission form, not a consent form, nothing. Not even something that looks like paperwork for the cafeteria. I told her I already had that covered. The sun was starting to gray the edges of the sky over the hospital parking structure when Diane called back, and she spoke for nearly 15 minutes without a single pause, the way she does when she has organized an entire argument in her head before dialing. David's life insurance policy had paid out $750,000 at the time of his death. Under the terms of the estate David had set up, quietly, years before his diagnosis, back when he was simply a careful man who built things meant to last. $280,000 of that had gone into an irrevocable custodial account in Lily's name, accessible in full at age 21, with a partial release provision at 18 for documented educational expenses. Maggie controlled the account as custodian until Lily reached majority. Nathan, as her stepfather, had no legal claim to it whatsoever, and no legal access to it under any ordinary circumstance. But Diane said, and I heard the weight she put on the word, if Lily were formally adjudicated as a minor requiring long-term psychiatric care, if a court found her incapacitated and in need of a guardian to manage her affairs during that incapacity, that guardianship could, under Pennsylvania law, be petitioned for by a step-parent residing in the household, especially one positioned as the more financially sophisticated party in the marriage. It wouldn't be automatic, but it would be possible, and a 14-day inpatient stay, backed by a psychiatrist's letter and a facility willing to extend the recommendation. If the first 2 weeks revealed additional concerns, that's exactly the kind of runway that makes a guardianship petition plausible in front of a judge who doesn't know the family. $280,000. A 14-day evaluation that, extended by a compliant psychiatrist with a financial stake in the facility doing the extending, could become something much longer. A 15-year-old girl locked behind a facility's doors, unable to explain to anyone what she had overheard in a hallway at midnight. A mother isolated and frightened into a silence so complete she couldn't meet her own father's eyes. I stood at the window at the end of the corridor, watching the sky over the city turn the color of a fresh weld, and I felt the pieces settle into place with the particular cold clarity that used to come over me on a job site the moment a suspected crack was confirmed under a load test. The sick certainty of watching a theory become a fact. This was not a stepfather who had lost patience with a grieving teenager. This was a structure, built carefully over 19 months, designed to fail in exactly one direction, toward exactly one outcome. I asked Diane what I needed to do. She told me, get Lily discharged into my temporary guardianship today, file for an emergency protective order, and get Frank's people pulling every financial record Nathan Cross had touched since the day he married my daughter. She also told me I needed something undeniable connecting Hale and Nathan before Nathan had time to sense the ground shifting under him and start distancing himself from it. I knew exactly who to call for that. Renee Okafor had spent 22 years as a forensic accountant for the FBI's Pittsburgh field office before retiring to open her own firm, and she and I had worked 2 infrastructure fraud cases together back when a contractor tried to falsify inspection reports on a bridge retrofit to cover corners he'd cut on the steel. She owed me nothing, professionally speaking, but we understood each other the way people do after they've watched each other be right under pressure. I called her at 7 that morning. She answered on the second ring, the way people do when they've long since stopped sleeping past dawn. I told her what I had. She said she'd call me back by noon. By 9 o'clock, Diane had filed the emergency temporary guardianship petition, and the hospital's attending physician, after reviewing Diane's documentation and hearing the specific questions I'd raised about Dr. Hale's referral letter, agreed to defer the inpatient recommendation pending an independent psychiatric evaluation from a physician with no financial relationship to any residential facility in the region. A hospital administrator delivered the news to Nathan and Maggie personally. I happened to be standing in the corridor when it happened, close enough to watch Nathan's composure crack for exactly 1 second before he smoothed it back into place. What came through in that 1 second was not confusion, and it was not concern for his stepdaughter. It was arithmetic. I watched a man run numbers behind his own eyes and not like the result. I took Lily home with me that morning. She slept for nearly 5 hours on my couch with the television murmuring low, the same way it had murmured in her hospital bay. And when she woke, I made her scrambled eggs and toast the way David used to make them, with too much pepper, because she'd once told me that was how he made them, and I had never forgotten it. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where the basswood bridge David built her, still sat on a shelf just visible from where she ate, and I told her plainly what I believed was happening and what I intended to do about it. She listened without interrupting, the way she listens to everything carefully, like she's storing it somewhere to draw later. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, turning her water glass slowly on the table. I knew something was wrong, she finally said. I just didn't think anyone would believe me over him. He wears nice suits and remembers everyone's name at church and tells jokes that make mom's friends laugh. Who's going to believe the 15-year-old over that? The people who bother to look closely, I told her, usually find that the men who are best at being liked in a room are often the ones working hardest to make sure no one looks past the surface of them. Rennie called at 11:50. She spoke for nearly 25 minutes, and I filled 4 pages of a legal pad taking notes the way I used to take notes standing under a bridge deck with a flashlight, because in both situations, the details are the entire case. Nathan had opened 3 joint accounts with Maggie in the 19 months since their wedding. 2 were unremarkable, a shared checking account, a modest joint savings account for household expenses. The third was different. Opened 7 months earlier, labeled on the paperwork as a family financial planning reserve, it had received 4 transfers from Maggie's primary account over that period, totaling $58,000. The listed contingent beneficiary, in the event of both account holders' death or legal incapacity, was a limited liability company registered in Delaware. Renee had pulled the LLC's registration. The sole listed member was a name neither Maggie nor I had ever heard in our lives, but Renee had also, at my request, run a record search on Owen Hale's known business communications, obtained through channels she assured me were entirely within the bounds of what her license allowed. What she found were 43 emails exchanged between Hale and Nathan Cross over the previous 11 months. The earliest of them predated Lily's referral letter by 9 months. They were not, Renee said, the emails of a concerned stepfather reaching out to a doctor for guidance on a struggling child. They were the emails of 2 men coordinating a timeline. I now had the emails, the account records, the Delaware LLC, Hale's undisclosed consulting fees from Silver Oak, and a hospital intake file built on a folder Nathan had prepared before anyone had asked him to. I had a 15-year-old girl with a bruised arm who had been placed in an ambulance at 1 in the morning over a crisis that had never existed. I had a mother who had been financially entangled and emotionally maneuvered into a silence so thorough she couldn't look her own father in the eye. And Frank told me when I called him with all of it that afternoon that I likely had somewhere between 48 and 72 hours before Nathan understood how much ground he had already lost and began trying to move money before anyone could stop him. I called Diane back. She called the Allegheny County District Attorney's office. I called Frank again. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, I had a meeting scheduled, and I had made one request of my own that I intended to hold everyone to. I want to tell you about the moment I understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, exactly what Nathan Cross had done to my daughter. It wasn't the financial piece. It wasn't even the legal piece. It was smaller than that. And it happened at 7 that evening, when Maggie appeared at my front door alone, having driven herself, wearing the same clothes she'd had on at the hospital 18 hours earlier, looking like a woman who had been awake for the better part of 2 days and was only now, finally, beginning to thaw. I let her in. She sat down across from Lily at my kitchen table, and she looked at her daughter's face for a long time, at the fading bruise on her wrist, at the paper hospital bracelet Lily still hadn't thought to cut off. "I'm sorry," Maggie said, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. "I'm so sorry I just stood there in that hallway." Lily looked at her mother for a moment. Then she got up, crossed the kitchen, and put her arms around her. And Maggie held on to her and wept in a way I hadn't seen since the week after David's funeral. I stepped out onto the back porch and gave them the room they needed. When Maggie was steady enough to talk, she told me everything, sitting on my porch steps in the last of the evening light. The arguments about money that she'd never fully understood, because Nathan always explained them in language designed to make her feel grateful for his expertise, rather than curious about his intentions. The account he'd encouraged her to open, framed as smart long-term planning for the family. The slow, patient way that over 19 months he had reframed every ordinary moment of teenage grief and withdrawal from Lily into evidence of something darker, not through cruelty, not through anger, but through a kind of relentless, reasonable-sounding concern that made Maggie feel every single time that he was simply the more informed one, the one who understood systems and risk and mental health in ways she didn't have the training to see clearly herself. He had never controlled her with anger. He had controlled her with expertise, real or invented, and he had spent 19 months carefully positioning himself as the only person in the house whose judgment could be trusted. She had handed him her financial accounts and her judgment, and nearly her daughter, because he had made himself, deliberately and patiently, into the only competent adult in the room. I thought about the handshake that lasted 1 second too long, the gut feeling I had chosen, out of politeness, to ignore. If I had said something that first night, if I hadn't told myself I was just a protective old man who would never think anyone was good enough for his daughter, I was not going to make that mistake twice. The meeting took place Thursday morning in a conference room on the 18th floor of the building where Diane Whitfield's firm kept its offices, high enough that the windows framed a slice of the river, and, beyond it, the pale steel arch of one of the 3 sister bridges I had spent a decade inspecting for load fatigue. I noticed it the moment I sat down, and something about it steadied me, a reminder that I had spent my whole working life learning to see the exact point where something everyone trusted was quietly failing, long before it became visible to anyone standing on top of it. Present in that room were Diane, Frank Delgado, Renee Okafor, an investigator from the Allegheny County District Attorney's Office named Patricia Nolan, and myself. We laid out, piece by piece, the structure Nathan Cross had built over 19 months. The financial entanglement in the family reserve account, the Delaware LLC and its undisclosed beneficial owner, the undisclosed relationship with Dr. Owen Hale, documented in 43 emails that began 9 months before Lily's referral letter was ever written, the timing of the push toward institutionalization, which happened to align almost precisely with the 2.5 years remaining before Lily's 18th birthday, and the partial release provision on her trust. Diane walked through the timeline with the same unhurried precision she brings to every legal argument she's ever made in front of me, turning 30 years of estate and fraud experience into a sequence a jury could follow without a law degree. Patricia Nolan took notes without a flicker of visible reaction, the professional stillness of someone who has heard a great many families' worst moments and learned not to let her face give away which category this one fell into. When Diane finished, Nolan closed her folder and looked directly at me. "I think we have more than enough here to open a formal investigation," she said. "If the email correspondence is what you've described, and the LLC's beneficial ownership is what your investigator found, we're looking at insurance fraud, an attempted fraudulent guardianship petition, financial exploitation, and depending on how the intake report is ultimately characterized, felony child endangerment." I thanked her and told her I had exactly one request. I wanted to be present for the conversation with Nathan. Not the arrest if it came to that, just the conversation. I had spent 35 years walking into rooms and laying evidence in front of people who had convinced themselves a structure would hold when it wouldn't. I wanted once more to do it myself. She considered it for a long moment, weighing something I couldn't read on her face, and then she said, "All right." We arranged it for Friday afternoon, under the framing of a mediation session regarding the emergency guardianship petition. Nathan arrived with his own attorney, a man who I would later learn had absolutely no idea, walking in, the scope of what his client had actually done. Nathan himself came in with the same smooth, unhurried confidence I had watched him wear in the hospital waiting room 3 days earlier. The posture of a man who still believed, on some level, that he was managing the outcome of the day. He shook hands around the table. He did not quite meet my eyes when he nodded at me. Diane opened with procedural language, calm and unremarkable, the kind of language that gives no warning of what's coming. Then she nodded to Renee, who opened her laptop and turned the screen toward the center of the table. What followed was the quietest 40 minutes I have spent in a room in my life. Renee walked through the financial records line by line, the transfers, the LLC formation documents, the beneficial ownership filing. Diane laid the printed email correspondence between Nathan and Dr. Hale beside it, page by page, alongside Silver Oak's nonprofit filing showing Hale's undisclosed consulting income. With every page that landed on the table, Nathan's attorney leaned back a little further in his chair, and Nathan himself grew very still, the particular stillness of a man realizing, in real time, that he is no longer the one managing this room. His attorney requested a recess. Nathan said nothing at all. When they returned 20 minutes later, the attorney informed the table that his client wished to cooperate fully with the investigation going forward. Nathan Cross was formally charged 5 weeks later with insurance fraud, filing a false police report, financial exploitation of a minor, and attempted fraudulent procurement of guardianship. He entered a guilty plea rather than face trial, and as part of his sentencing he received 4 years, with the possibility of parole after serving a portion of that term, along with a restitution order covering every dollar he had moved out of the joint account. Dr. Owen Hale surrendered his medical license entirely, as part of a separate settlement with the state medical board, and will never practice psychiatry again in Pennsylvania, or, under the terms of that settlement, in any state that recognizes reciprocal board discipline. Silver Oak Adolescent Center is currently under state licensing review, and 2 other families, once the investigation became public record, came forward with strikingly similar accounts involving Hale's referrals. The joint family reserve account was frozen, and following the guilty plea, the full $58,000 was recovered and returned to Maggie. The Delaware LLC was dissolved by court order, and the $280,000 that David Reyes had quietly, carefully set aside for his daughter years before he ever knew he was sick, the money that had, in the end, been the entire quiet engine driving everything Nathan Cross had built, remained exactly where David had left it, untouched, waiting for a daughter who is, God willing, going to need every bridge her father and I ever tried to teach her how to build. It's early spring now. The city has that particular gray-green Pittsburgh look it gets in April. Rivers running high and fast with snowmelt. The bridges I used to inspect for a living, catching the light in a way that still, after all these years, makes something in my chest settle when I drive across one. Maggie sold the house she'd shared with Nathan and moved into a rental 4 blocks from mine, close enough that Lily walks over most afternoons after school. Maggie is in counseling twice a week now, with a therapist who specializes specifically in coercive financial control within relationships, And she is, slowly, in the careful and unglamorous way real healing actually happens, learning to trust her own read on people again. She calls me every Sunday morning now, which she never did in the 2 years of her marriage to Nathan, and we talk about small, ordinary things, what she's reading, how the tomatoes she planted on her new back patio are coming along, Lily's upcoming spring recital. Lily is 16 now. The bruise on her wrist healed within 2 weeks, though I notice she still, sometimes without seeming to realize it, rubs that spot when she's anxious. She played first violin in her school's spring concert in March, and I drove over early to get a seat in the second row, and when she found me in the crowd afterward, still holding her violin case, she hugged me the way she used to hug her father, both arms wrapped tight, no hesitation in it at all. She still fills sketchbooks with drawings of bridges. Last month, she showed me a new one, a cantilever design, technically sound in a way that made me sit up a little straighter, with a small caption written in pencil in the corner. For Dad, and for Grandpa, and for the bridge that didn't fall. A few weeks ago, she sat down next to me on my back porch after dinner and was quiet for a while, watching the light fade over the yard. Grandpa, she finally said, can I ask you something? Always, that night at the hospital. Before you knew anything about the accounts, or the emails, or any of it, how did you already know something was wrong? Just from looking at him? I thought about it for a moment, because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. 35 years of inspecting bridges teaches you to read the gap between what a structure looks like it's doing and what it's actually doing underneath, I told her. Nathan was sitting in a hospital waiting room at 1 in the morning because his stepdaughter was supposedly in crisis and he was relaxed. Not the relaxed of a man relieved that help has finally arrived. The relaxed of a man who has just finished executing something he spent a long time planning. Those two kinds of calm look almost identical to most people. They didn't to me. She nodded slowly, turning that over. I kept waiting for someone to notice, she said. For months, I kept thinking, someone's going to see it eventually, and nobody did. Until you did. I put my hand on her shoulder. That's the thing about people who build what he built, I told her. They're very good at making the person with the least power in the room feel like the problem belongs entirely to them. That's how they get away with it for as long as they do. But nobody can hide a load path forever. Eventually, there's always one crack that gives the whole thing away, one phone call at 1 in the morning that starts pulling the rest of it apart. She looked at me for a long moment. You're the crack that gave it away, she said. For him, I mean. I thought about David standing in my garage all those years ago with a set of brass pins and a block of basswood, asking me patient, careful questions about truss geometry because his daughter wanted to understand her grandfather's work. I thought about Maggie, learning to trust her own judgment again in a rental house, 4 blocks from mine. I thought about Lily in the second row of that concert hall, holding her violin like it was the most solid thing in the room. I'm the phone call, I told her, and as long as I'm standing, I always will be. If there is a child in your life trying to tell you something, and the confident, well-dressed adult standing next to them keeps explaining it away in language that sounds reasonable, please, listen past the explanation. Listen to the gap between what is being said and what that child's eyes are actually asking you to see. The most dangerous people in a family are rarely the loudest ones in the room. Most often, they're the ones who sound the most reasonable, right up until the moment the whole thing comes apart. A structure doesn't fail because no one built it carefully. It fails because everyone around it learned to walk past the crack without looking at it too closely. Don't walk past it. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a child you fought for, or a crack you almost walked past yourself, tell me about it in the comments. And I'll ask you the same question my granddaughter asked me. What would you have done standing in that hallway at 1 in the morning in my place? If you believe in showing up for the people who call you at an hour no one else would answer, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story from this channel.